The wind howled through the vast, snow-covered wilderness of northern Alaska, carrying with it a biting chill that turned the landscape into an unforgiving white abyss. The thermometer outside Daniel Cole's remote cabin had plunged to a bone-chilling 45 DFF, the coldest night in years. The dense pine forests, normally alive with the distant calls of wildlife, were now eerily silent, buried under thick layers of ice. The only sound was the rhythmic creaking of trees as they strained against the relentless force of the wind. Daniel, a seasoned survivalist and former wildlife researcher, sat by the dim glow of his crackling fireplace, his fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. He had lived in isolation for years, drawn to the untamed beauty of the Arctic frontier. Here, survival wasn't just a skill, it was a way of life. He had seen the brutality of nature, had witnessed the merciless cycle of life and death in the wild. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to experience. As he peered through the frost-covered window, the world outside seemed like a frozen wasteland. But then, something moved, a shadow against the blinding white. His heart pounded as he wiped the glass with his sleeve, clearing the frost. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A massive grizzly bear, her fur crystallized with ice, stood just feet from his cabin. Her enormous body trembled with exhaustion, but it wasn't just the cold that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. Behind her, 3 small cubs huddled together in the snow, their tiny bodies shaking violently. And then, to his absolute disbelief, the mother bear did something unimaginable. She raised her paw and knocked on his window. Daniel's breath hitched as he took a step closer to the window, his pulse pounding in his ears. The sight before him was something out of a dream. No, a nightmare. The massive grizzly bear, easily weighing over 600 pounds, stood on her hind legs, her frozen fur glistening under the pale moonlight. Her dark eyes locked onto his, pleading. But what shook Daniel the most was her deliberate action, the way she raised her paw and knocked on his window, not once, but 3 times, in a steady, rhythmic pattern. Bears don't knock. Bears don't beg. Daniel had spent years studying wildlife, tracking their behaviors, documenting their survival instincts. He had always respected the natural order, observing from a distance, never interfering. But now, that belief was shattering before his very eyes. His gaze shifted past the mother bear to the 3 shivering cubs at her feet. They were barely the size of house dogs, their tiny bodies sinking into the deep snow, their breaths coming in ragged, visible puffs. The smallest cub collapsed onto its side, its frail body trembling before going eerily still. The mother bear's reaction sent a shiver through Daniel's spine. She turned abruptly, scooping up the smallest cub in her jaws, cradling it with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature so powerful. Then, with the same calculated intent, she pressed the limp cub against the window, as if showing it to him, as if making him understand. Daniel's stomach twisted. He knew what he was seeing. He knew why she had come. She wasn't searching for food, she wasn't seeking shelter. She was begging for help. Outside, the wind screamed through the valley, shaking the wooden beams of his cabin. The snowstorm was intensifying, the temperature dropping further with each passing minute. Daniel grabbed his thermal jacket, his mind racing. What could have driven this bear family from their den in the dead of winter? Bears hibernate during this season, unless something had forced them out. A cave-in? A predator? Something had gone terribly wrong. He looked back at the cubs, the weakest one barely clinging to life. If he did nothing, they wouldn't survive the night. Daniel had never interfered before. He had always let nature take its course. But this wasn't nature. This was something else entirely. Then the mother bear did something that shattered every doubt in his mind. She sat back on her haunches, lifted both of her massive front paws, and held them together in a prayer-like motion. Her eyes never wavered. Daniel's heart pounded. This wasn't instinct, this was intelligence. This was a mother begging for her children's lives. And Daniel knew in that moment he had to act. Daniel's hands trembled as he grabbed his thickest coat and shoved his feet into his insulated boots. His mind was racing, calculating every possible scenario. He had spent years respecting the boundary between man and nature. But this wasn't just nature's doing. Something had forced this bear family out of their den, and now they were at his mercy. Through the frost-covered glass, the mother bear's breath fogged up the window, her dark eyes locked onto him, desperate yet controlled. Behind her, the smallest cub barely moved, its tiny chest rising and falling in weak, shallow breaths. The second cub stumbled, legs wobbling beneath it, while the third pressed against its mother's leg, whimpering softly. Daniel knew that if he didn't act now, they wouldn't survive the next hour. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the door handle. A blast of biting wind surged through the cabin as the door creaked open. Immediately, the mother bear took a step forward, her massive frame blocking the wind, shielding her cubs from the worst of the cold. Daniel froze. This was the moment where everything could go wrong. One wrong move, one sign of aggression, and this could turn deadly. He raised his hands slowly, palms up. "I'm here to help," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she understood. Then, something astonishing happened. The mother bear stepped aside, exposing her weakest cub, as if presenting it to him. Daniel's breath hitched. He moved forward cautiously, kneeling in the snow, his hands trembling as he reached toward the tiny, frost-covered body. The cub didn't stir. It was barely breathing, its fur crusted with ice, its small frame unnaturally still. With the gentlest touch, Daniel scooped the cub into his arms. It was too cold, too limp. A heartbeat so faint he had to press the cub against his own chest to feel it. Behind him, the mother bear let out a low, guttural sound, a plea, not a threat. She was trusting him. Daniel rose carefully, stepping backward toward the cabin. The mother bear's massive head followed his every move, but she didn't stop him. Instead, she turned to her other cubs, nudging them closer, wrapping her own body around them for warmth. Daniel crossed the threshold, slamming the door shut against the howling storm. Inside, the warmth hit the cub immediately. Daniel moved fast, grabbing a blanket, a heating pad, anything to raise its body temperature. He rubbed its tiny paws, willing life back into them, checking its pulse, listening to its faint breaths. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then, a miracle. The cub stirred, a weak whimper escaping its mouth. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Outside, the mother bear remained at the window, watching. She was still waiting, and Daniel knew his rescue mission wasn't over yet. The tiny bear cub trembled in Daniel's hands, its breath shallow, its fragile body barely responding to the warmth inside the cabin. Time was against him. He knew that hypothermia had already set in. Every second counted. He wrapped the cub in a thick wool blanket, gently rubbing its tiny paws, trying to restore circulation. The heat from the cabin was beginning to do its work, but the cub was still too weak. Its body shivered violently, then went eerily still. No. Daniel's heart pounded as he rushed to the fireplace, grabbing a heating pad. He tucked it inside the blanket, creating a cocoon of warmth. He massaged the cub's body in steady, controlled motions, trying to stimulate its circulation. "Come on, little one. Stay with me." A faint whimper escaped the cub's mouth. Its eyelids fluttered, then closed again. Outside, the mother bear's massive shadow loomed against the frosted window. Her breath fogged up the glass as she peered inside, her eyes locked on Daniel's every move. She knew he was trying to save her baby. Then Daniel heard it. A soft thud against the door. Then another. The other two cubs. His pulse quickened. He turned toward the door, his mind racing. If the mother bear had brought her other cubs closer, it meant they were in just as much danger. She was trusting him again. Daniel exhaled sharply, pushing himself to his feet. He threw on his coat, grabbed a second blanket, and moved toward the door. With a deep breath, he cracked the door open, icy wind slamming into his face. The mother bear stood there, her fur glistening with ice, her two remaining cubs huddled at her feet. One of them looked stronger, still able to stand, but the other was barely moving, its tiny body trembling violently. Without hesitation, Daniel knelt in the snow, stretching out his hands in an unspoken offer. The mother bear hesitated for only a second before doing something that sent a shiver down his spine. She nudged the weakest cub forward. She was giving him another chance. Daniel carefully scooped up the second cub, wrapping it in the blanket and cradling it close to his chest. The third cub whimpered, stepping closer to its mother, uncertain. Daniel hesitated. The strongest cub still had a chance to survive outside, but the other two wouldn't last another hour. He met the mother bear's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. She blinked slowly, as if giving him permission. He backed into the cabin, shutting the door against the brutal cold. Now he had 2 cubs to save. Every instinct in his body screamed that this was impossible, that he shouldn't be doing this. But when he turned back and saw the 2 tiny lives curled up near the fire, their weak bodies clinging to warmth, he knew he couldn't stop now. Outside, the mother bear remained at the door, waiting, watching, trusting. Daniel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The cabin was warm, but the air carried the tension of an unfolding battle, a battle against time, against nature, against the relentless cold that threatened to steal the lives of the tiny cubs. The first cub, the one he had rescued earlier, had stopped shivering. It was breathing, but still weak, its tiny body curled against the blanket. The second cub, the one the mother had given him just minutes ago, was far worse. Its paws were stiff, its breath shallow and erratic. Daniel knew he was running out of time. Think, Daniel, think. He had seen this before, on brutal hunting trips with his father in his younger years when frostbite had nearly claimed his hands. If the cub was too cold to shiver, it meant its body was shutting down. His mind raced. He needed to warm it up faster, but not too fast, or the shock could kill it. He pulled the second cub closer to the fire, carefully unwrapping the blanket enough to let the heat seep in gradually. He rubbed its tiny paws, its ears, whispering words he wasn't sure the cub could even hear. Outside, a powerful gust of wind howled through the valley, rattling the wooden cabin walls. The mother bear remained just beyond the door, her heavy breathing fogging the frost-covered glass. She was waiting, hoping, trusting. Daniel turned back to the cub, his pulse hammering. The tiny bear still wasn't responding. His chest tightened. No, he wasn't going to lose this one. With steady hands, he grabbed a clean towel, dipped it into warm water, and gently pressed it against the cub's body, trying to stimulate circulation. Nothing. Panic surged inside him. He had to get its blood moving. Without thinking twice, Daniel carefully lifted the cub inside his thick coat, pressing it against his chest, letting his own body heat fight for its survival. Minutes passed, excruciatingly slow. Then a twitch. Daniel held his breath. He felt it, the faintest movement. The cub whimpered softly, its tiny body shifting slightly, and Daniel nearly collapsed from relief. "You're still here," he whispered, gripping the cub gently but firmly. But he wasn't done. He turned toward the door. The third cub was still outside. It was stronger than the other 2, but the temperature was plummeting fast. If the storm worsened, even the strongest wouldn't make it through the night. Daniel swallowed hard. He had been lucky twice. But could he push his luck a third time? Outside, the mother bear stomped her paws anxiously in the snow, as if sensing his hesitation. Then, in an action that sent chills down his spine, she pressed her massive paw against the door, mirroring the same silent plea she had made before. Daniel exhaled shakily. This wasn't over yet. The storm outside was finally dying down, but inside the cabin the real battle had already been fought. And won. Daniel sat on the wooden floor, his back resting against the fireplace, his breath still shaky from the adrenaline rush. All 3 cubs were alive. The first one, now warm and steady, nestled against the thick blanket he had wrapped around it. The second, the one that had nearly slipped away, was breathing deeper, its tiny paws twitching slightly as warmth returned to its body. And the third, which had been the strongest of the three, had finally made it inside, curling up beside its siblings, absorbing the warmth of the fire and the safety of the cabin. Daniel ran a tired hand over his face, barely believing what had just happened. Hours ago, he had been a spectator to something impossible. A grizzly bear, a wild animal, had come to him not as a predator, but as a mother in desperate need of help. And instead of turning her away, instead of hiding behind fear or instinct, he had helped her. His gaze shifted toward the door where the mother bear still waited, her massive silhouette outlined against the snow. She hadn't left. For the first time, Daniel noticed something in her posture that he hadn't before: exhaustion. Not just from the cold, but from the sheer weight of what she had endured. Her instincts had told her to fight for her cubs. But tonight, she had done something no bear in history had ever done. She had trusted a human with their lives. Daniel took a deep breath and slowly, carefully got to his feet. He knew what had to happen next. With deliberate movements, he scooped up the first cub and approached the door. The mother bear didn't move. She just watched him, waiting. Daniel hesitated, then, with the utmost care, he opened the door just enough to place the cub onto the snow-covered ground. The little bear blinked in the cold air, then wobbled toward its mother. She didn't react immediately. Her dark eyes flicked to Daniel's, searching for something, some kind of unspoken confirmation. He nodded. Only then did she move. With incredible gentleness, she nudged the first cub closer to her with her nose, then looked back at Daniel. It was his turn again. One by one, he carried the other two cubs to the doorway, carefully placing them in the snow. The mother bear never moved aggressively, never broke the fragile trust that had formed between them. She simply waited, acknowledging each return with a soft, rumbling breath. Finally, all three cubs were huddled against her. Daniel took a step back, his heart pounding as he watched what happened next. The mother bear lowered her head and licked each cub, checking them over, ensuring they were safe. Then, to his astonishment, she turned back toward him, one last time. And in an act that sent chills down Daniel's spine, not from fear but from something much deeper, she raised her massive paw and placed it softly against the threshold of the door. A silent gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't need words to understand what she was saying. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, the mother bear gathered her cubs and disappeared into the darkened forest. Daniel stood at the door long after she was gone. His cabin, once just a shelter against the wilderness, felt different now. Tonight, something had changed, not just for the bear, but for him. The world outside had returned to its icy silence. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a landscape coated in thick snow, untouched except for the fading tracks leading back into the forest. The mother bear and her cubs were gone. But Daniel was still standing at the doorway, his breath visible in the frigid air, staring into the darkness where they had disappeared. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, his hands still slightly trembling from the intensity of the night. Something deep inside him had shifted. He closed the door and turned toward the cabin, his gaze falling on the mess left behind. A pile of blankets lay crumpled near the fireplace, the faintest imprint of tiny paws still visible on the fabric. The half-empty thermos of warm milk sat untouched on the wooden table, steam still curling faintly from its rim. It all felt surreal. Daniel exhaled and slowly walked to the fireplace, sinking into the old wooden chair that had been his father's. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what had just happened. A wild animal, a grizzly bear of all things, had defied every law of nature to ask him for help. And not only had she understood that she needed a human, but she had trusted him, fully, completely. And he had trusted her back. For years, Daniel had lived in the mountains, seeking solitude, trying to distance himself from a world that had felt too complicated, too chaotic. He had believed that nature existed in absolutes, that there were predators and prey, the strong and the weak, those who survived and those who didn't. But tonight he had witnessed something that shattered that belief. Tonight he had learned that trust could exist beyond species, beyond fear, beyond instinct. Tonight he had learned that even in the most brutal conditions, in the face of the unforgiving wilderness, life was not just about survival, it was about connection. He looked at the rifle mounted above the fireplace. For years it had been his most reliable tool, a symbol of his place in the wild, a reminder that out here, survival was a constant battle. But now it felt different, out of place. Daniel stood up, walked over to the wall, and reached for the rifle. His fingers traced over the polished wood, the cold steel of the barrel. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he took it down. He wasn't sure what he would do with it. Maybe he would keep it, maybe he would store it away. But, for the first time, he felt no need for it. As the fire crackled softly, Daniel sat back down and pulled out an old notebook. He hadn't written in it for years, but tonight he needed to. He flipped to a fresh page and after a long moment of thought began to write. Tonight I learned that survival isn't just about strength. It's about trust. It's about understanding. It's about knowing when to put fear aside and choose something greater than yourself. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of a moment that would stay with him forever.